this is Compassionate Therapy's YouTube channel, and this week I'm discussing how to identify trauma in yourself and others. And the reason why I'm raising awareness and the reason why I'm discussing this is because it's a great way of understanding your own behaviour, processing things that happen to you, realising that there is a bigger picture, realising that we all do things for a reason. And with this realisation and with this awareness, we can just live in more harmony. We can also get the help we need more quickly. And so over the next few weeks, I'm going to be talking about how to, once you've identified the traumas and the issues that you've got, we can talk about what the interventions do, how they can help, and just empowering you through choice. So again, I am working from a PowerPoint. I've been using these resources to take into schools, to train frontline staff, just so we become more trauma informed, and this way we can quickly access the help and the resources that we need, and we can quicker identify the problems and therefore reach the resolutions. So again, hopefully the PowerPoints will appear on the screen as I talk through them on the video. So what is trauma? Well, trauma is a word used to describe an extremely distressing or disturbing situation or event that has a significant impact emotionally, psychologically and energetically. It results in feelings of intense fear, helplessness or sorrow. This can have profound impact on mental, emotional and physical well-being, which can disrupt someone's sense of safety and security. This can greatly impact a wide range of psychological and physiological symptoms, and these can manifest almost immediately after the experience or can begin to appear days, weeks, months or years later. So in brief, what are we looking at that can trigger this level of trauma? Well, physical abuse, infliction of physical harm or injury by another person, such as punching, hitting or kicking. Sexual abuse involves any unwanted sexual activity or contact, including rape, molestation or sexual exploitation. Emotional abuse involves patterns of manipulation, humiliation, belittlement or constant criticism that erodes a person's self-esteem and emotional well-being. Neglect, failure to provide adequate care, attention or basic needs such as food, shelter or medical care, resulting in physical or emotional harm. Domestic violence, physical, sexual or emotional abuse within an intimate or familiar relationship, often characterised by control, intimidation and power imbalances. Childhood trauma, traumatic experiences occurring during childhood such as physical or sexual abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence or living within a war zone or turmoil or antisocial environment. Natural disasters such as catastrophic events caused by nature, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, not as significant in this country, but obviously the impact of that can be physically and psychologically distressing. And again, any accidents that you might have, being involved in them or just witnessing severe accidents such as car crashes, industrial accidents or traumatic injuries. And then there's medical trauma, traumatic experiences related to medical procedures, surgeries, severe illnesses, even as a child, if perhaps you're having to constantly have your blood taken or have some sort of intrusive work with needles. All of this can really have significant traumatic effects. Combat trauma, trauma experienced by military personnel in war zones, including exposure to combat, witnessing violence and dealing with the loss of comrades. And then there's refugee or war zone trauma, traumatic experiences endured by individuals displaced from their homes due to war, political unrest or persecution. Community violence, exposure to violence in one's community, such as gang violence, shooting or riots. Bullying, persistent harassment, intimidation or aggression, often experienced in schools, workplaces or online platforms. Terrorist attacks, traumatic events involving intentional acts of violence and terrorism causing widespread fear and distress. And then interpersonal violence, so trauma resulting from violent acts committed by another person. So moving on from that, not just having personal experiences that can cause trauma. Vicarious trauma refers to the indirect exposure to traumatic events through witnessing or hearing about them from others. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how this could apply to you or somebody that you know. Professionals working in fields such as emergency services, healthcare, social work, law enforcement, they all may experience vicarious trauma. They regularly encounter individuals who have experienced traumatic events, and consequently we can harbour a lot of these in our own traumatic experiences and behaviours. So emergency responders, such as paramedics, firefighters, police officers, who witness or respond to accidents, violent incidents or natural disasters, may all experience this vicarious trauma due to repeated exposure to distressing events. So healthcare workers, again, such as doctors, nurses and therapists, who provide care to individuals who have experienced trauma, such as survivors of abuse, accidents, terrorist attacks, may all experience vicarious trauma because we're listening and we're absorbing and we're empathising with the survivors and those individuals. So journalists and reporters and professionals covering traumatic events like acts of terrorism, natural disasters, violent crimes may all be exposed to vicarious trauma through repeated exposure to distressing stories and images. And then along with the vicarious trauma is intergenerational trauma. Now this is something that's becoming more and more talked about and more realised and more relevant. So intergenerational trauma refers to the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next. So this can occur when the effects of trauma experienced by parents or ancestors continues to impact subsequent generations. So perhaps you are of a certain culture, of a certain religion, of a certain nationality, and your parents or grandparents were exposed to any of those traumatic experiences that I explained about earlier. This has such heavy impact on them that it's passed down. So even though you may not feel like you've been through a trauma, you are sharing in and you're carrying the burden through the resulting behaviours that are subconsciously inherent. So in the UK, various historical events and social contexts have contributed to intergenerational trauma. So here are some examples of that. So World War II, trauma experienced by individuals who lived through the war, including bombings, loss of loved ones, displacement, can impact subsequent generations in the form of this intergenerational trauma. Colonialism, the history of British colonialism with its systemic violence, exploitation and cultural suppression has had intergenerational effects on communities in former colonies. The descendants of those affected by colonial trauma may experience ongoing psychological and social impacts. Immigration and displacement. Families who experience forced migration, displacement or refugee status due to conflicts, political unrest or persecution may carry these burdens psychologically. And again, these can be passed down. So obviously at the moment it's really relevant for us with the war in Ukraine and the effects that is then carrying forward. Historic abuse, instances of historical abuse such as in institutional settings or within families can lead to intergenerational trauma when the effects of the abuse are not adequately addressed, impacting the mental health and well-being of subsequent generations. So again, this is what I'm trying to do. The more we talk about it, the more we realise it. The more we realise it, the quicker it can be resolved. With trauma, the sooner there is some level of intervention, the less impact it has damaging psychologically and physically. So again, school bullying. Persistent and severe bullying experienced by students can lead to emotional trauma, affecting mental health, well-being, self-esteem, and therefore the academic performance. Again, not so relevant in this country, but in America there's all the school shootings, although we did have the incident at Dunblane. Traumatic events such as shootings or acts of violence within the education institutions can have a profound and long-lasting impact on students, staff and the wider school community. And in that bracket, it's quite relevant at the moment in the news. There's a lot of pressure on teachers, on schools, governing bodies to do with Ofsted reports and reaching targets. And this is having a consequence on individuals' mental health. When there is some level of damage to an individual's mental health, and therefore they take a decision to make a devastating choice, that then cascades into that school environment, and everybody is living that trauma through witnessing and being exposed to that. So child abuse or neglect. Students who've experienced child abuse or neglect may carry the effects of trauma into the educational settings, which can impact their behaviour, academic performance and social interactions. Workplace violence. Incidents of workplace violence such as physical assaults, threats or harassment can cause trauma among employees, leading to anxiety, fear and a hostile work environment. And also accidents at work, accidents or injuries at work, serious workplace accidents resulting in physical injuries or fatalities can traumatise employees and impact their well-being, productivity and job satisfaction. Sexual harassment or assault. Instances of sexual harassment or assault in the workplace or in the education system can lead to significant trauma for victims, affecting their mental health, job performance and overall well-being. Organisational restructuring or layoffs. Significant organisational changes such as layoffs, downsizing or restructuring can create a climate of uncertainty and job insecurity, causing stress and trauma among employees. And toxic work environments. I know that every job I have to some level has had that, whether it be through the pressures from management or whether it be through other colleagues and staff members. Toxic work environments, prolonged exposure to toxic work environments characterised by bullying, discrimination or toxic leadership can result in psychological trauma for employees, impacting their mental health and job satisfaction. So again, this is what I'm bringing. I'm bringing some level of resolution into these environments by raising awareness. If we're all a little bit more mindful about our own words and actions, this then has a knock-on effect. So, types of trauma. Trauma is a complex psychological response that occurs when a person experiences or witnesses an event or series of events that are perceived as highly threatening, dangerous or overwhelming. These events can exceed an individual's ability to cope, leading to a profound disruption in their sense of safety, security and well-being. So I'm going to look at a few of those now. So acute trauma, this just refers to a single traumatic event, such as a car accident, a physical assault or a natural disaster. Chronic trauma, this involves repeated and prolonged exposure to traumatic events, often in an interpersonal relationships. Examples include ongoing physical or sexual abuse, domestic violence or being in a war zone. So complex trauma, this occurs when a person experiences multiple and varied traumatic events over an extended period, typically during childhood. It can result from ongoing abuse, neglect or exposure to violence within the family or community. So what are the impacts of that? Well, emotionally, trauma often elicits intense and overwhelming emotions such as fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame or sadness. These emotions may persist long after the traumatic event has occurred. The cognitive impact, trauma can affect a person's thinking processes. They may experience intrusive thoughts or memories of the event, have difficulty concentrating or making decisions and struggle with memory recall. So the physiological impact, trauma can trigger a range of physiological responses. These include increased heart rate, rapid breathing, sweating, muscle tension and a heightened startle response. Some individuals may also experience physical symptoms such as headaches, stomachs or fatigue. And this is why this sort of thing is brilliant, because it really does give us some answers. So perhaps if you are suffering with any sort of chronic physiological conditions, it could be tied in with a hidden trauma that you're holding within your physical body. So the behavioural impact, trauma can lead to changes in behaviour and coping strategies. So some individuals may engage in avoidance behaviours, trying to avoid reminders or triggers associated with the traumatic event. Others may exhibit increased irritability, aggression or social withdrawal. So if you or anyone you know that perhaps is suffering with anger issues that they can't explain or they don't understand, or perhaps you once used to feel like you would go out all the time and all those places and all those hobbies and all those activities you used to engage in, for whatever reason you've just felt like withdrawing. All of these can be tied in to a hidden or an unresolved trauma. And what matters is not that we solely focus on that, it's that we're able to untie and resolve it. And through realisation and raising awareness, that is the key. So the interpersonal impact, so trauma can affect a person's ability to form and maintain healthy relationships. It may lead to difficulties with trust, intimacy and emotional connection. So if perhaps you feel alone and you don't understand why you keep attracting the wrong kind of people into your life, or you keep pushing people away, it can be tied in with these effects of trauma. And the worldview impact, trauma can shatter a person's belief in the world as a safe and predictable place. It can lead to a sense of vulnerability, loss of faith, or a distorted perception of oneself, others and the world. Everybody has the right to feel safe and everybody has the right to be happy. And sometimes all of these can just not be functioning as they should be, and therefore we're pushed into this sense of fear, shame, guilt, or withdrawing from the right to have the life that we want. So who can be affected by trauma? Well, we did briefly touch on this earlier. As well as the individual survivors of trauma, people around them can also be affected, such as family members, the community, and sometimes staff associated with recovery, corporate organisations, education and government bodies, and in the case of critical incidents, it can have a negative impact nationwide. This is why being trauma informed is so important for all. So again, as I mentioned earlier, people like therapists and counsellors, first responders at incidents, and journalists and reporters can all be affected by trauma. And also child protection workers, so professionals involved in child welfare, such as social workers, child protection workers, you all may experience vicarious trauma due to the exposure to cases of child abuse, neglect or violence. Witnessing the suffering and trauma experienced by children can have a profound impact on the mental health and the well-being of others working in these organisations. So humanitarian aid workers, individuals working in humanitarian aid organisations, often operate in crisis zones and disaster-stricken areas where they witness and respond to the suffering of others. The continuous exposure to human suffering, mass casualties and extreme poverty can lead to this vicarious trauma, as workers may struggle with feelings of grief, guilt and helplessness. And also in the legal professionals, so lawyers, solicitors, attorneys and legal professionals, dealing with cases involving traumatic events such as violence, sexual abuse or accidents, this can all lead to this vicarious trauma. They may be exposed to graphic evidence or witness testimonies and the emotional strain of supporting clients through the traumatic legal processes. And then again in the workplace, managers and team leaders, all responsible for supporting and guiding their employees, they may experience vicarious trauma when their team members face significant challenges, personal crisis or workplace traumas. The burden of supporting and managing the well-being of others can also take an emotional toll and lead to vicarious trauma. Customer service representatives who interact with customers or clients on a regular basis, they may encounter individuals who may be angry or may be expressing distress or talking about traumatic experiences. These stories of personal tragedy, loss or abuse can all evoke this emotional reaction and this vicarious trauma as they empathise with the customer's pain. And non-profit and advocacy organisations, employees that work and are involved in those, with vulnerable populations or addressing sensitive issues, all of these can produce this vicarious trauma due to the exposure to the traumatic experiences of the beneficiaries or of the clients. The emotional toll of hearing and working with individuals who have experienced trauma can impact employees in these settings. Military professionals, soldiers and military personnel can develop symptoms of vicarious trauma due to the exposure of combat. Witnessing the injury or death of comrades and experiencing the long-term effects of deployment. These experiences can have a significant impact on mental health, leading to post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety. And again, human resources. So even in HR, in an office environment, dealing with employees who have issues, who have conflicts, who have health problems, including cases of workplace harassment, discrimination, emotional distress. All of this is a constant exposure to these traumatic experiences and the responsibility of having to handle these situations. All of this again can lead to vicarious trauma as HR professionals absorb and empathise with the emotional impact on others. And generally just support staff, employees in administrative or support roles, they may indirectly experience this vicarious trauma by hearing or witnessing the effects of traumatic events on colleagues. They might be affected by the emotional strain, especially if they form close relationships with their co-workers, or the traumatic event directly impacts the work environment. So this is so important because the way we feel, especially in a working environment or a school environment, we have to be there all the time. We almost do it without having that level of choice. So the more emotional burden, the more impact it's going to have on our health and our physical well-being and mental well-being. And again, in the schools, students, including primary, secondary and further education, students may experience trauma as a result of personal experiences such as abuse, neglect, loss of loved one or exposure to violence, but additionally students who've come from disadvantaged backgrounds or face other adversities may also be vulnerable to trauma. And teachers and school staff, educators, staff members can all be affected by trauma in the education system. They may encounter students who've experienced trauma and are dealing with the effects, which can have an emotional toll on staff members themselves. Teachers may also face traumatic incidents within the school environment, such as violence, bullying or accidents. And parents and guardians, trauma experienced by children can also impact the parents or guardians or other family members, siblings as well. Seeing the child struggle with trauma-related issues can be so distressing for parents and family members and may affect their own well-being. And in some cases, parents or guardians themselves may have experienced trauma which can directly impact their involvement in their child's education. And peers and classmates, trauma experienced by other students can have a ripple effect on peers and classmates. Witnessing a classmate's trauma or being indirectly affected by it can create a challenging environment within the school community. And so school communities, trauma can have a broader effect on overall school community. It can influence the social dynamics, relationships between students and teachers, and the overall climate of the education institution. Trauma within the community, such as local incidents or social events, can also impact the education system. So let's look at this from a case study perspective, so we can kind of bring some sense to it. So there's Sarah. She's experienced an acute trauma. Sarah was involved in a severe car accident. She sustained injuries and witnessed the traumatic event unfold. Following the accident, Sarah experiences intrusive thoughts and nightmares about the accident, avoiding driving of cars altogether, and becomes easily startled by sudden noises. She also develops physical symptoms such as headaches and difficulty sleeping. Sarah's symptoms persist for several months, affecting her daily life and relationships. She is eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and seeks therapy to address her trauma. So number 2, Mark. He has chronic trauma. Mark grew up in a home where he experienced ongoing physical and emotional abuse from his alcoholic father. The abuse persisted throughout his childhood. As a result, Mark develops low self-esteem, struggles with trust and forming healthy relationships, and experiences symptoms of anxiety and depression. He often feels on edge and is hypervigilant. Hypervigilant means that he's always on alert, and he's always almost unable to sit still and control himself because his body is looking out for any levels of perceived danger. Constantly anticipating danger. Mark starts therapy to address the impact of his chronic trauma and works towards healing and rebuilding his life. And then case study number 3 is Elena. She suffers from complex trauma. Elena grew up in an area plagued by violence and crime. She witnessed stabbings, experienced bullying, and had an absent and neglectful caregivers. Elena displays symptoms of complex trauma, including difficulties with emotional regulation, self-destructive behaviours, and a pervasive sense of emptiness and detachment. She also struggles with forming stable relationships and experiences chronic feelings of loneliness. Elena engages in therapy that incorporates trauma-focused interventions to address her complex trauma history and promote healing. So again, there are some really great examples of people who have suffered. They've had to reach a point in their life where they've approached the idea of having therapy. And there are so many interventions that can be used to help people be able to manage themselves, be able to heal. And the beautiful thing about learning those is they're a really great way of sharing, connecting with others, and being able to build up the ability to trust and to build relationships again, which can all be lost through the side effects of trauma. So understanding behaviours, trauma can deeply impact the mind, body and soul of individuals. Mentally, it can lead to intrusive thoughts, memory problems and distorted beliefs. Physically, trauma activates the stress response, resulting in physiological changes, sleep disturbances and potential health issues. Spiritually, trauma can disrupt one's sense of self-trust and belief systems, causing feelings of shame, guilt and existential questioning. Healing from trauma involves addressing those effects through therapy, self-care and support to restore well-being in all aspects of life. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail about what is going on when we've experienced a trauma, and this way we're better able to understand that our behaviours are a result of our physical reaction, our mental reaction and our psychological reaction to this trauma, which has such a damaging effect on our bodies and is something that is out of our control. So inside the brain you have glands called the amygdala, and it's an area in the brain that is involved in processing emotions, and it plays a central role in the response to trauma. And when someone encounters a traumatic event, the amygdala becomes highly activated and triggered. So the stress response, fight or flight. This releases hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. So this heightened activation can lead to this feeling of anxiety, fear and hypervigilance. And in the wild, this would be a great resource for being able to flee danger. But in modern day living, it just causes us a lot of blockages and a lot of disruption to our daily life. So another part of the brain is called the hippocampus. This is responsible for memory formation and regulation, and this can be negatively affected by trauma. So high levels of stress hormones, particularly cortisol, can impair the functioning of this hippocampus. So as a result, individuals may have fragmented or incomplete memories of the traumatic event. So if you feel that there is something that you can't remember, or you're suffering with some sort of memory issues, it can all just be that this hippocampus has been damaged by something. And this is a great way, again, of just being able to untie and let go and realise what you need and have to do to go through the healing process. So, altered prefrontal cortex functioning. So the prefrontal cortex, this is the part of the brain that is involved in decision making, impulse control and emotional regulation, and it can be impacted by trauma. Trauma can disrupt the normal functioning of this region, leading to difficulties in rational thinking, problem solving and emotional regulation. Individuals may experience heightened emotional reactivity and difficulties in controlling impulses and impaired judgment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to integrate a slide into this, because one of the greatest psychotherapists that I follow, and I use a lot of her teachings, the way she describes this is there's 3 brains as such, and one of them functions your natural processes that don't involve any conscious awareness, like your digestive system, your reproductive system, your stress response system, so your blood pressure and your heart rate. Then there is the emotional reactivity part of your brain, where you laugh, cry, and again, when this is affected by trauma, it can induce those feelings of fear, anxiety or sadness. And then you have the ability to be able to rationally think, rationally decide what you like, what you don't like, who you are. And when there's a disruption, when there is some sort of traumatic disruption inside of that flow, they all go out of sync. And the automatic parts of our brain work far faster than our rational part of our brain. And the rational part of our brain works quite fast. So all of our reactions that happen before we can even think, they are kicking in, and if they are damaged in any way, this is why panic attacks, this is why the stress response, this is why our negative reactions can totally overwhelm us before we can even have the ability to rationalise and to sort of slow all that down. So through interventions, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring these 3 brains back to a whole, being able to stay calm, being able to use that ability to control our reactions and just bring them all back together. So dysregulation of the stress response. Trauma can dysregulate the body's stress response system, which involves your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland and your adrenaline glands, and together these are known as the HPA axis. And in response to trauma, the HPA axis can become overactive, resulting in chronically elevated levels of stress hormones. And this can lead to long-lasting physiological and psychological effects, including increased anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a compromised immune system. So when you have experienced a lot of trauma, your body is so stressed out. Everything is going off. So it's no wonder that you can't sleep. It's no wonder that you may be having this level of pain, like a tension being held inside of your physical body. And pain is so connected to this level of experience as a side effect. So changes in neurotransmitter levels. So trauma can disrupt the balance of neurotransmitters in the brain. For example, trauma has been associated with decreased levels of serotonin, a neurotransmitter involved in mood regulation. So low serotonin levels can be linked to depression, anxiety, and increased risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. So because of this traumatic damage, it's no wonder that you feel the way you feel. And realising and understanding that it's not you, it's your nervous system reacting. That is such a great step It's such a great way to realise that you can get better because we can heal this. So alterations in brain structures. Prolonged exposures to trauma can lead to structural changes in the brain. For instance, the volume of the hippocampus may decrease, affecting memory and emotional regulation. The prefrontal cortex can also undergo changes, impacting cognitive functions and impulse control. And these structural alterations can contribute to long-term difficulties in emotional and cognitive functioning. So you are actually brain damaged by trauma. And you can recover from that. But this is why emotionally and psychologically there are so many side effects. And it's no wonder that in a society and in a community we are all struggling and going through this. So as I mentioned earlier, the fight or flight response. So when we're faced with a traumatic event, the body's sympathetic nervous system is activated, triggering this fight or flight response. Now the response prepares the body to either confront threat or escape from it, and it involves physiological changes such as your increased heart rate, rapid breathing, elevated blood pressure and heightened senses. So even just by learning how to bring all of that down and back into your control is a great way not only to heal but moving forward to prevent from being that activated, and to some extent it's essential that we do have this ability. So stress hormone release. The body releases stress hormones, particularly adrenaline and cortisol, in response to trauma. These hormones help mobilise energy reserves, increase alertness and prepare the body for action. While they can be beneficial in the short term, prolonged or excessive release of stress hormones can have negative impacts on physical and mental health. So again, this just highlights the fact that all of these are subconscious reactions that are out of your control. So no wonder we're all going to feel pushed to the limit when we are experiencing lives that are generally traumatic on a daily basis. Again, muscle tension. So trauma can cause increased muscle tension throughout the entire body, particularly in response to this perceived threat. The tensions can lead to physical discomfort, muscle pain, headaches, general sense of bodily tightness or stiffness. So you hold the trauma physically by the way the body works, and you're going to be able to feel physical pain even sometimes years after experiencing a traumatic situation that you may even not realise is there, unresolved and hidden. Your nervous system dysregulation. Trauma can disrupt the balance of the nervous system, which controls all of your automatic bodily functions. So this dysregulation can result in irregularities such as your heart rate, your breathing patterns, your digestive system and other bodily processes. And some individuals may experience symptoms such as rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, gastrointestinal issues or changes in appetite. So do you suffer from IBS? Do you suffer from migraines? Do you suffer from panic attacks? Do you suffer from heart palpitations? It can all be tied in with this hidden trauma. So immune system suppression. Trauma can temporarily suppress the immune system's functioning. The release of stress hormones, particularly cortisol, can interfere with the immune responses, making individuals more susceptible to infections, illnesses and delayed wound healing. So skin conditions as well. Psoriasis. This is why it's all linked in with problems with stress, and being able to learn to manage those problems can impact and improve everything else in your physical body. Sleep disturbances. Trauma can disrupt normal sleep patterns. Many individuals who experience trauma may struggle with insomnia, nightmares or disrupted sleep, which can further contribute to fatigue, irritability and difficulties concentrating and memory. So again, if you're always on edge, if sometimes you're going through an experience and you suddenly realise that you haven't listened or absorbed anything that was going on, you are on edge, you are waiting for a perceived danger that you don't even know is happening, because all of these behaviours are subconscious, and it's just the way your body is reacting to the trauma that you've been through. It's held deep inside of your subconscious. So chronic health issues, prolonged or repeated exposure to trauma can increase the risk of developing chronic health conditions. Trauma has been associated with a higher likelihood of developing conditions such as cardiovascular diseases, chronic pain, gastrointestinal disorders, autoimmune disorders, and mental health disorders like post-traumatic stress, depression and anxiety. So here we have it. It's no wonder the NHS is under so much pressure, and it's no wonder so many people are suffering, because we have been through so many traumas, individually and collectively, and this is just the way our body is reacting. This is just a natural response. So fear and anxiety. Traumatic events can evoke intense fear and anxiety during and after the traumatic experience. Individuals may feel a persistent sense of danger, hypervigilance, again, always on the lookout, and an increased sensitivity to potential threats. This heightened state of fear and anxiety can make it challenging to feel safe and secure, even in non-threatening situations. Shock and disbelief. Immediately following a traumatic event, individuals may experience a state of shock and disbelief, and this can be difficult to comprehend the magnitude of the trauma or fully process what's happened. This initial response serves as a protective mechanism, allowing individuals to cope with overwhelming emotions. Anger and irritability. Trauma can invoke feelings of anger, frustration and irritability. Individuals may direct their anger towards themselves or others, or even inanimate objects. The loss of control or the injustice of the traumatic event can contribute to these strong emotional reactions. Guilt and shame. Survivors of trauma often grapple with the feelings of guilt or shame, questioning their actions or blaming themselves for the events. These emotions may arise due to perceived responsibility, survivor guilt, feeling guilty for surviving when others didn't, or societal stigmatisation associated with certain types of trauma. Sadness and depression. Trauma can lead to feelings of profound sadness and depression. The overwhelming nature of the trauma, the loss experienced, and the challenges in coping can contribute to a sense of despair, emptiness, and a loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities. Emotional numbness. In some cases, trauma can result in emotional numbness or a disconnection from emotions. This can serve as a defence mechanism to protect oneself from the intensity of the traumatic experience. Individuals may find it difficult to experience or express emotions, feeling emotionally detached or disconnected from others. Flashbacks and intrusive memories. Individuals who have experienced trauma can have flashbacks or intrusive memories where they vividly re-experience aspects of the traumatic event. These experiences can trigger intense emotions, making it challenging to differentiate between past trauma and present reality. Hyperarousal and hypervigilance. As I've mentioned these previously, trauma can lead to a state of heightened arousal and hypervigilance. Individuals may be constantly on edge, easily startled, and have difficulty relaxing. This hyperarousal can contribute to sleep disturbances, difficulties in concentration, and an overall sense of being on high alert. So it's known that the human body generates an electromagnetic field, which is produced by the electrical activity going on inside of your cells and organs. So this field, often referred to as the biofield or the human energy field, is believed to interact with the environment and potentially influence physiological processes. So some researchers propose that traumatic experiences can impact the body's electromagnetic field and potentially leading to imbalances and disruptions. So again, this is more on following the meridian flows of your body. and your heart is your biggest, strongest electromagnetic organ that's pulsing, and this is all feeding into your field, and this can be tied in with the blockages that can happen more on this energy level. Trauma can cause significant physiological changes, including alterations in your heart rate, your blood pressure, your hormone levels, and the brain activity. And it's conceivable that these physiological changes might be accompanied by alterations within your electromagnetic field. But further research is needed to establish exactly about these clear connections. And it's worth noting that alternative therapeutic approaches such as energy healing modalities, Reiki, acupuncture, biofield therapies, all of these I do offer and include in my treatments. They propose the balancing and restoration of the body's energy, the electromagnetic field, as a means to promote this holistic healing and well-being. So heightened sensitivity, trauma can lead to heightened sensory sensitivity, where individuals become hyper-aware of their surroundings. They may experience increased sensitivity to sounds, lights, smells, and physical sensations. These heightened sensitivity is often associated with that hypervigilance and the body's fight or flight response. Sensory overload. Trauma can overwhelm the senses, leading to a state of sensory overload. Individuals may become easily overwhelmed by sensory stimuli and find it challenging to filter or process sensory information effectively. This can contribute to feelings of distress, anxiety, and a sense of being overwhelmed by the environment. Dissociation. In response to trauma, individuals may experience a dissociative state where they feel detached from their senses or perceive them differently. This can lead to a sense of numbness or detachment, where sensory experiences can become distorted, muted, or fragmented. This is actually quite common in children who experience some level of trauma. They are able to almost witness the experience from a different perspective, as if it wasn't happening to them. Or in some cases, it can just be that they go somewhere else. So again, this can be where part of them splits off and totally disconnects and dissociates, so doesn't remember anything about the trauma. And then later on it can lead to presenting symptoms of other personalities. Altered perception of time. Traumatic events can disrupt the perception of time. Individuals may experience time distortion, where moments feel stretched or compressed, and this can impact the ability to accurately perceive the sequence of events or make sense of the passage of time. Flashbacks and intrusive sensory memories. So trauma can trigger flashbacks, where individuals vividly re-experience aspects of the traumatic event, including sensory details. These intrusive sensory memories can involve vivid sights, sounds, smells, or physical sensations associated with the trauma, causing intense distress and emotional reactions. Sensory triggers. After experiencing trauma, certain sensory cues or triggers can invoke intense emotional and physical responses. These triggers may be associated with aspects of the traumatic event, such as particular smells, sounds, or visual stimuli, and the presence of these triggers can elicit anxiety, fear, or a state of heightened arousal. Numbing of sensory experiences. In some cases, trauma can lead to a numbing or blunting of sensory experience. Individuals may feel a reduced capacity to fully engage or experience sensations, resulting in dulled perception of the environment. So what impact does this have on human development? So the impact of trauma on human development can be significant and pervasive, affecting various aspects of an individual's physical, cognitive, emotional and social development. And because we're all so different and we all perceive trauma in a different way, this can vary greatly. So I'm going to give you some key areas in which trauma can influence human development. So the brain development, we have talked a bit about this before. Trauma experienced during critical periods of brain development, such as early childhood, can disrupt the normal growth and the functioning of the brain, and this can result in structural and functional changes that impact cognitive abilities, emotional regulation and behaviour. So emotional regulation and behaviour, trauma can disrupt the development of healthy emotional behavioural regulation skills. Individuals who've experienced trauma may struggle with managing their emotions, displaying heightened emotional reactivity, impulsivity, aggression or withdrawal. Difficulties in self-regulation can persist into adulthood and impact relationships and overall well-being. And attachment and social relationships. So trauma can disrupt the formation of secure attachment and healthy social relationships. Early traumatic experiences can affect the development of trust, intimacy and the ability to form healthy connections with others. Individuals may have difficulties in developing and maintaining relationships, experiencing feelings of isolation or mistrust. Cognitive development. Trauma can impact cognitive development, including areas such as attention, memory and problem-solving abilities. Chronic exposure to trauma can interfere with the cognitive processes, leading to difficulties in learning, concentration and academic achievement. Sense of self and an identity. Traumatic experience can significantly impact one's sense of self and identity development. Individuals who have experienced trauma may struggle with self-esteem, self-worth and a sense of personal agency. Trauma can shape perceptions of oneself and others and the world, leading to negative self-beliefs, shame or a distorted self-image. Physical health. So trauma can have a long-lasting effect on physical health and development. Stress-related physiological responses, such as elevated levels of stress hormones, can contribute to various health problems, including cardiovascular issues, compromised immune functions, gastrointestinal disorders and chronic pain. Mental health. Trauma is closely linked to mental health difficulties. Individuals who have experienced trauma are at high risk of developing mental health disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety disorders and substance abuse issues. These mental health challenges can impact overall functioning and well-being throughout a lifespan. So what is this development of psychological and substance abuse? Psychological abuse can develop as a result of trauma and can have a severe and lasting impacts on all individuals' mental and emotional well-being. So I'm going to talk through an overview of how psychological abuse can evolve, and also the development of substance abuse can be intertwined within this trauma, and it can significantly impact individuals' psychological well-being and coping mechanisms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So a traumatic event. Psychological abuse often begins with exposure to a traumatic event, which can be an ongoing pattern of harmful behaviours, emotional manipulation or power imbalances within relationships. Traumatic events can include experiences such as verbal or emotional aggression, gaslighting, humiliation, constant criticism, control or threats. The impact on self-perception. So trauma, particularly when accompanied by psychological abuse, can distort an individual's self-perception. Constant negative messages and belittlement can erode self-esteem, causing individuals to doubt their worth, their capabilities and their value. The individuals may internalise the negative beliefs and see themselves as fundamentally flawed or unworthy. Emotional manipulation. Psychological abuse often involves emotional manipulation tactics aimed at controlling people, and the abuser may use tactics like guilt tripping, blame shifting, minimising or denying the impact of their actions, or manipulating emotions to maintain power and control over others. The manipulation can cause victims to question their own reality and become dependent on the abusers for validation and approval. So isolation and control. Psychological abuse frequently involves isolating people from their support systems such as family and friends, and in order to maintain control, the abuser may limit the victim's social interactions, control their access to resources, and create a sense of dependence on the abuser. This isolation further exacerbates the victim's vulnerability and increases their reliance on the abuser for emotional support and validation. So breaking the cycle, breaking free from psychological abuse often requires support, intervention and a safe environment, and it is essential that survivors seek assistance from trusted individuals, support groups or other professionals experienced in trauma and abuse. And therapy can be instrumental in healing from the effects of psychological abuse and rebuilding self-esteem and developing healthy coping mechanisms. Trauma bonding. In some cases, trauma bonding can occur where survivors develop a strong emotional bond with their abuser due to intermittent, reinforced or positive and negative behaviours. The abuser may alternate between moments of kindness or affection and episodes of abuse, creating confusion, reinforcing the victim's attachment to the abuser, and this complex emotional bond can make it challenging for the victim to break free from the abusive relationship. So long-term effects of psychological abuse through trauma, they can have a long-lasting effect on survivors' mental health and well-being. And it can lead, as I say, to symptoms of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health issues. And survivors will struggle with self-confidence, trust and forming healthy relationships in the future. So let's look at coping mechanisms. Trauma can lead individuals to seek coping mechanisms to manage the overwhelming emotions and distressing memories associated with traumatic events. And some individuals might turn to substance abuse, such as alcohol or drugs, as a way to self-medicate and numb emotional pain. Substance use can temporarily alleviate symptoms of anxiety, depression or intrusive memories associated with trauma. And escaping or avoiding symptoms, substance use can serve as a means of escape or avoidance for individuals struggling with the effects of trauma. And drugs or alcohol may provide a temporary reprieve from distressing thoughts, memories and emotional pain. This relief can reinforce the association between substance use and the alleviation of trauma-related symptoms. Self-medication and dependency. Individuals may develop a reliance on substances as a way to self-medicate and manage the ongoing effects of trauma. And over time, this self-medication can lead to substance dependency or addictions. Substance use can become a maladaptive coping mechanism where individuals feel unable to function or manage daily life without the substance. And then there's co-occurring disorders. So trauma and substance abuse often co-occur with other mental health disorders. Individuals who have experienced trauma may be at an increased risk for conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety disorders or dissociative disorders. Substance abuse can exacerbate the symptoms of these co-occurring disorders and complicate the recovery process. So trauma triggers and relapse. Trauma can act as a trigger for substance abuse and vice versa. Trauma-related triggers such as certain people, places or situations can elicit intense emotional responses and cravings for that substance. This can increase the risk of relapse and create a cycle where trauma and substance abuse reinforce each other. Healing and recovering. Addressing trauma and substance abuse requires a comprehensive approach that includes trauma-informed care, therapy and substance abuse treatment. Effective treatment involves addressing the underlying trauma, developing healthy coping mechanisms and providing support for substance abuse recovery. Therapy modalities such as trauma-focused therapy, cognitive behaviour therapy and support groups can be beneficial addressing both trauma and substance abuse. So what I'm trying to do here, raising awareness and looking out for those signs of trauma, the sooner we realise, the sooner we can get the help we need and the less damaging the effects of this trauma is going to be. So hidden trauma can manifest in various ways, and individuals may exhibit different signs and behaviours depending on the coping mechanisms and the nature of the trauma. Here are some common behaviours and signs that could indicate hidden trauma. And we have spoken about some of these previously. So avoidance. Avoidance is a common coping mechanism for individuals with hidden trauma. They may avoid certain people, places or activities that remind them of the traumatic event or trigger distressing emotions and memories. Emotional instability. Hidden trauma can lead to emotional instability, including sudden and intense emotional outbursts, mood swings, irritability, or difficulty managing emotions. The individual may struggle to regulate their emotions effectively. Anxiety and hyperarousal. Persistent anxiety and a state of hyperarousal are common signs of hidden trauma, and the individual may constantly feel on edge, experience restlessness, have difficulty relaxing, or exhibit an exaggerated startle response. Social withdrawal and isolation. People with hidden trauma may withdraw from social interactions and isolate themselves from others. They may feel disconnected from friends and family, or have difficulty forming and maintaining relationships. Changes in sleep patterns. Trauma can disrupt sleep patterns, and individuals may experience insomnia, nightmares, or frequent awakenings during the night. And on the other hand, some individuals may sleep excessively as a way to escape from the emotional pain associated with the trauma. Hypervigilance. Hidden trauma can lead to a heightened state of alertness and hypervigilance. The person may constantly scan their environment for potential threats, be overly cautious, or have difficulty relaxing due to persistent sense of danger. Self-destructive behaviours, and in my next video I'm going to be going into a little bit more detail about these. Some individuals with hidden trauma may engage in self-destructive behaviour as a way to cope or numb their emotions. This can include substance abuse, self-harm, risky sexual behaviours, or engaging in a dangerous activities. Emotional numbing. Hidden trauma can lead to emotional numbing or a feeling of being emotionally detached. The individual may have difficulty experiencing positive emotions or may seem apathetic or indifferent. Difficulty trusting others. Trust issues are common among individuals with hidden trauma. They may have difficulty trusting others, constantly anticipate betrayal or harm, deep connections due to the fear of being hurt again. Physical symptoms. Hidden trauma can manifest as physical symptoms such as headache, chronic pain, gastrointestinal issues, or other unexplained physical complaints. These symptoms may have no apparent medical cause, but can be related to psychological impact of trauma. So raising awareness of trauma is so important to me because it makes perfect sense. Even if it's on an individual level, and especially on a collective level, if we are all suffering from an unresolved hidden trauma, we're just carrying a cycle forward, and we're not able to fully be there for others in an understanding level, but also to help people heal. So raising awareness of trauma in schools and organisations is crucial to me. It allows for identification and support of individuals who may be experiencing trauma but have not disclosed it. So by dispelling misconceptions and reducing stigma, awareness creates a safe and supportive environment where individuals can share their experiences without judgment. It enables prevention measures, early interventions, and trauma-informed practices that promote well-being, academic success, and resilience. Ultimately, raising awareness builds a resilient community, fostering healing, understanding, and a culture of compassion that supports individuals affected by trauma. Early intervention is essential for recovering from trauma, as it helps prevent further complications by addressing trauma-related symptoms before they escalate. It promotes resilience and equips individuals with coping skills to manage stress and navigate challenges. And by intervening early, it restores a sense of safety and trust, creates a supportive environment and addresses underlying issues connected to the trauma. Early intervention reduces the long-term impact of trauma and increases the likelihood of achieving a more complete recovery and restoring overall well-being. And while early intervention is key, individuals can still benefit from support and interventions at any stage of their recovery journey. I see the good in everyone. Okay, it's fundamentally important that we do that, and we realise that behaviour breeds behaviour, and as part of our evolution, culturally and in communities, we have to start coming together by raising awareness and by breaking the cycles, and that is exactly what I'm trying to do from these videos. So thank you for watching. This video has been on how to identify trauma. Next week's video will be on self-destructive behaviours, and what I'm aiming towards is a really nice structure of understanding, identifying, and then approaching ways of being able to help yourself. And if you are navigating your way through the therapy field, it's giving a little bit more information about exactly how these interventions work so that you can make better choices when picking a therapist or picking a treatment plan. So my name's Emma, these videos are through Compassionate Therapy, and thank you for watching, thank you for